Okay, hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I have a confession to make. This is my first time streaming, doing live stream on YouTube, and I'd actually I wanted to do a live stream on hyperinflation, inflation, all those things, and we will definitely get into that today. But I'd actually did this live cast talking about the whole topic, and at the end of it, and I gave, I think, the most brilliant talk about inflation of my life. And I realized I'd forgotten to click go live. So this is actually my second attempt at doing this. So like I said, this is my first time live streaming. So please bear with me. I'm new to this, as you can see. I can't believe I forgot to click go live. I started talking and here we are. But anyway, so I really wanted to bring this topic to the public because my channel is about, decoding the daily economic news and removing the spin, removing any kind of partisan bias, and putting the data and the economic news in proper context, in the context of, a solid economic theory, an economist's understanding of how the economy works. And so, what really set me off, and to do this video and start this talk, is all this talk about hyperinflation. Okay, and I'm going to share my screen with you to show you this ad that I saw on Facebook. So just one moment while I share a screen. Okay, and I hope you can see this, but so let's talk about this ad. And I don't mean to single out this company because they are not the only ones. But they are talking about the inflation tsunami, investing during a rising inflationary tide. And this is not the only ad that I saw. There was a lot of talk on social media, on YouTube, some from, I consider credible people talking about hyperinflation. They're talking about how you need to redo your portfolio, your investment asset allocation, and they make everything sound so scary, And I wanted to say, as an economist, I find some of the recent talk about hyperinflation to be a bit absurd, and we're going to get into the details of that. But this is a perfect example of why I'm starting this channel, is because I feel like there are people out there who are preying upon the public's lack of training in economics. They're preying upon your fears. They are taking advantage of the fact that you are not a trained economist, and that's not your fault, right? They should, these kinds of people, financial experts and whatnot, should be acting more responsibly, but they're not, right? And so that kind of thing is out there right now. But there's also a more general problem that I want to briefly mention, is that even when you turn into some of the mainstream outlets for economic news, there is a problem with the clickbait ad revenue model that drives most of their behavior, which is they're incentivized to make things sound apocalyptic. Right? It's the end of the world. Some of the more, I would say, reputable, more mainstream credible outlets are also indulging in this kind of language. And so I thought, now's a good time to start this channel and begin these kinds of conversations of decoding the economic news and, having a more rational, calm conversation about what the numbers mean. right? And today's topic is really it's hyperinflation, right? That word is being thrown out rather carelessly right now, really in an effort to kind of scare you, right? So let's decode that right now, okay? And the first thing that we're going to do is look at the Economist definition, the typical definition of hyperinflation, right? So I'm going to share my screen with you. Hopefully that you can see that. But first, you know, with all these terms like hyperinflation being thrown around, let's first define it more precisely so that you can judge for yourself whether it's real or not, or it's happening right now. So if you look at this definition, hyperinflation typically exceeds rates of increase of 50% per month, right? We're talking about a rate of increase of 50% per month. And it's not just one or two commodities or goods and services. We're talking about a general increase in prices of the economy, typically measured by the consumer price index. And hyperinflation has a threshold of 50% per month. Now, I'm going to ask you to kind of, just take a breath here, kick back, and ask yourself, is that the situation that you experience on a daily basis right now, right? Has prices increased 50% per month for you? I'm going to guess that probably no, right? You probably have noticed some price increases in foods. There's been some increases in prices of used cars. Certainly the housing market is heating up. It's been hot for a while. The housing market is something that I want to tackle in a follow-up live stream and talk about what's going on there and help you tease out, the exact economic data and what all that means. But for now, let's stick to the topic, which is, right now we're talking inflation, hyperinflation. And if you ask yourself, and myself, for me too, when I go outside for lunch or to buy groceries for myself, do I experience 50% increases per month? The answer is likely no, right? And so when we talk about hyperinflation, let's look at the definition again, okay? Let's look at the definition again. Hyperinflation typically occurs in times of war and economic turmoil in the underlying production economy, right? There is a little phrase here about, the central bank printing excessive amount of money. That is also a separate topic that we can discuss another time, about what's happening with the Federal Reserve and the money supply. But what I can say right now is that we're not going to indulge in any kind of conspiracy notions. I mean, there are legitimate ways to criticize the Federal Reserve and their actions, but we're not going to indulge in conspiracy theory. We're going to stick with sound economic analysis, in this channel. And so hyperinflation typically takes place in times of great economic downturns, like wars, so, if you're not experiencing this kind of 50% increase per month, then you have to ask yourself, why are we throwing out terms like hyperinflation right now? Well, there is, quite frankly, an incentive on the part of actors in the financial industry. And like I said, in the general news media themselves, to hype up this kind of talk about, it almost seems like the end of the world, right? Now, if hyperinflation was real, would that be a valid cause for concern? The answer is yes. Of course it's real. I mean, of course it's a valid concern if it's real, right? if hyperinflation was real, the Federal Reserve would have no choice but to raise interest rates significantly. That would induce a major crash in the stock market. The cost of money, of borrowing, would go up drastically. So businesses would suffer, unemployment would rise. So if you assume that hyperinflation is actually happening, yes, actually it's a pretty bad scenario, but we need to stay focused on actual data. We're not going to get involved with the hype. And like I said, that the whole point of this channel is to remove the hype, remove the spin, right? And so the data that we're seeing right now, and it's being watched by the Federal Reserve as well as lots of independent academic economists, and it's showing that actually no, we're not experiencing price increase anywhere near the threshold of what we call hyperinflation. So let's kind of dispense with that kind of fear and that kind of hyperventilating at this point, right? Because the picture doesn't fit. Okay, we are not experiencing 50% on 50% increases in the price increases in the economy. It's not happening. Could it possibly happen? Maybe, in the sense that anything's possible, but it's not happening, and the data isn't showing that, right? So the first layer to unpeel is that any notions of, if somebody comes up to you, talking about hyperinflation and all this stuff, and say, show me the data, right? Show me the data, because I don't see it. There's been talk about prices increasing in lumber, prices increasing in used automobiles, and so on and so forth. But and we'll address those concerns in this broadcast. We'll talk about that. But I simply want to kind of put to rest any fears that you might have that hyperinflation, by any traditional definition, is happening right now. It's not real, right? So that's why when you look at let's go back here. When you look at advertising like this, inflation tsunami, reallocating redoing your investment portfolio because a tsunami of price increases coming your way. It's a pretty silly talk, right? It really is. It's pretty silly talk. And so to further drive in the point, excuse me, let's look at some historical data on inflation in the United States, okay? This comes from Macro Trends, and this is historical inflation rate by year, right? And let's take a look at what's happening right now, because the data is going up to 2021. Okay, let me enlarge the screen for you so you can see better. Right now, we are at about 3.35% inflation. Let's call it 3.5%, because these measurements are always estimations. We are at 3.5%, and recently, prior to all this talk about hyperinflation, we were at about, let's call it even and say it's about 2% inflation rate. So we went from 2% to 3.5% conservatively, right? And so does that sound anywhere near like the 50% per month increase that we're seeing? Not really. It's about a 1% increase over the last maybe 6-7 months, right? So again, that puts this talk about hyperinflation in its proper perspective, right? And let's take another look at more of the historical data, because I think it really helps to put things further into proper context, right? So let me blow that up on the screen. And so you can see over the course of the decades that we've had quite a bit of variability in terms of inflation. So if we're to go back to the 1974, we're talking about 12% inflation, and this is 1979, 13% inflation. Around this period, I think it was probably the action of OPEC. They were squeezing a lot of people on the price of oil. And I remember there were, lines at the gas stations and all those sorts of things. And certainly that was a dire situation. And going back to, let's say, 1945, we are at 18% inflation rate. And, going further back in 1918, we had 20% inflation. So this is probably related. I'm not sure about the exact date. This is probably related to the world wars and that, and right now you can see in this chart that we went from about 2% to 3.5% inflation rate. Now think about that for a second. We enjoyed historically low rates of inflation of 2%. We are now moving into 3%, possibly 4% territory this year. And yet we have survived periods of inflation that went up to 12%, 18%. And I think you could you could make the case that the economy has evolved quite a bit since those earlier times. But you know what? The forces of supply and demand are still operating, right, in the economy. That itself really hasn't changed. And now we're hearing in the news about, there was one article that said, are consumers ready for a whole new world of inflation, of price increases? I think that was an article on Bloomberg, which is, usually pretty credible, but a whole new world. A 1% increase in about 6 to 7 months, and suddenly we're in a whole new world. What whole new world are they talking about? Look at this. In 1979, we were at 13% inflation rate. It went up to 18%. 1946, we are at 3.5%. So what whole new world do they mean? Are they thinking that inflation is going to keep going up and up and up until we're at 20%, until we reach the threshold of 50% increases per month? So when you consider, the definition of hyperinflation, when you consider the historical data and match them up against the threshold, you realize, this talk about hyperinflation is a little absurd, quite frankly. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't have a very, valid policy discussion about, the meaning of these recent price increases, but that's not hyperinflation, right? So let's talk about that. Is there a meaningful policy discussion that we can have about the impact of COVID, the pandemic and the lockdowns, and what's happening with prices right now? Yes, absolutely. That is something that's being discussed by academic economists and I'm sure the administration and lawmakers and whatnot. And the nature of that conversation, though, needs to be placed in the proper context, which is, it's not that, and of course the Federal Reserve doesn't believe in hyperinflation. In fact, it doesn't believe in permanent price increases, right? So this policy debate that's taking place internally within the Federal Reserve, with economists and with lawmakers, it's not about whether we're about to hit 50% per month increase in prices and we're getting into the whole new world of hyperinflation. No, what they're really debating is whether these price increases are temporary or permanent. And by temporary we mean typically less than a year. and by permanent, over a year or perhaps 2 years, right? Persisting past the 2-year mark. And those are typically the time spans that economists consider, because price signals and distribution of goods and services, those things need time to work its way through the economy, right? It's not, excuse me, there's a motorcycle going by, of course, while I'm making a vital point here. But anyway, so that policy, and so can we tease out what's happening in the economy on this live broadcast? And the answer is no. So let's start doing that. Okay, so we've dispensed with the whole thing about hyperinflation. Now we're talking about the timing of these price increases, and let's tease out what's happening by looking at the definition of inflation itself. Okay, so looking at this chart, let me quickly, this is a little dry, I admit this is a little dry, but let me quickly read the definition of inflation. What are the factors that go into inflation, right? So among them are cost plus inflation, or the decrease in aggregate supply of goods and services stemming from an increase in the cost of production, and demand pull inflation, or the increase in aggregate demand characterized by households, businesses, governments, and foreign buyers. Okay. Now, I know that's a little dry, so we need to pull back and put that in kind of plain language terms. But yeah, so let's consider that. Okay. So what does that mean with regards to our current situation with the pandemic and the lockdown and all that stuff? So first, let's consider the first definition, which is a decrease in aggregate supply of goods and services. Right. Now we know during the lockdown that actually did happen. Right. Restaurants were shutting down. They were operating at limited capacity. Theaters were shut down. Sports arenas were empty. Sporting events were basically virtual in the sense that they're being broadcast. There's no audience. So a lot of things were being shut down due to the pandemic. So yes, there's no denying the fact that the supply of goods and services did decrease. Right. Now, looking at the second component of that definition of inflation, which is a decrease in, or an increase or a decrease in aggregate demand, right? And what happened to demand during the lockdown? Well, a lot of us were sitting around, watching Netflix. We weren't going out watching movies. We weren't doing a lot of things, going out nature hiking, spending money on appliances or anything of that nature. And so there was definitely a decrease in aggregate demand. Now we're coming out of that, and that's the real policy question. What happens now, right? The decreases in the supply, in aggregate supply, the decreases in aggregate demand are undeniable. Of course, they take place. The question is, as we come out of this, because of the vaccine, and the effect of that is kind of reverberating through the economy. Prices are fluctuating, right? And we're wondering, how long is this going to last? If you imagine dropping a rock into a pond, the ripples across the surface, how widely do they spread and how long do they go on? That's really the policy debate that's taking place right now, right? So forget about all the shysters, all the people who are trying to scare you. This is the real debate that's happening right now. And I don't know that if I would really call it a debate, because let's look at those two components, right? First, at the supply thing. I think one good example that happened, which is kind of amusing, but not amusing if it happened to you or you were frustrated, was the toilet paper situation at Costco, right? People were very concerned, I would say very scared, that they would run out of toilet paper because they're locked out at home. So there was a surge in demand, and the supply of toilet paper. I mean, it was just sold out everywhere at Costco. Not only at Costco, but Albertsons and some of the local stores where I tried to buy. Excuse me. I tried to buy toilet paper, and I suffered like most people, wondering if there's going to be enough for everybody. But talking to the manufacturers, reading some articles about their comments about how they're responding, they made it clear that it's not necessarily a supply problem, but a distribution problem. They said the manufacturing capacity is there, but because of COVID safety protocols, the logistics had become much more complicated, and distributing the toilet paper throughout the economy had become challenging, right? But we know that was resolved. There's plenty of, toilet paper in Costco right now. I can go tomorrow and buy as much toilet paper as I'm not going to, because I'm not irrational. I know that the supply chain issues have been fixed, but the point I make there is that businesses are profit-making machines, and they are highly motivated to solve these logistical problems, these manufacturing problems. I'm not saying that they're easy, but they are highly motivated to solve these issues, because otherwise they're out of business, right? And we all want to stay in business, right? So with the vaccines being available now, I believe that these logistics problems and the safety protocols are going to ease, and we're going to start to see a smoother distribution of goods, and of course providing services, because now social interactions or physical interaction is a lot easier. So the supply side problems, while very challenging, are still very much present. We can pretty much surmise reasonably that they are going to subside. They are not a permanent condition, right? It would make sense. It would make no sense that after we had the vaccine, that we would, businesses and supply chains would remain in the same condition as they were as during the lockdown, when we're all wondering, when is this pandemic going to be under control, right? So we can anticipate in the short run, or relatively in the near future, that these supply concerns and distribution problems are going to ease, right? Now, excuse me, let's look at the demand side of the equation, because there have been some concerns about two things. One is that we've all been, at home watching Netflix. Netflix has done great, during this period. The stock price went up quite a bit. And, we haven't been spending our money. So people are concerned that as we come out of the restrictions, we have saved money during the lockdown, which will, there was an artificial decrease in demand. So there's going to be an artificial increase in demand for goods and services, because now we're free to spend money and go about our lives. And then, of course, the other component of that is that there's some concern that the government payments, the COVID relief bill and unemployment benefits, are also making it easier for people to spend money. They've had all this pent-up demand. They wanted to go out and go back to enjoying life. So let's look at that. I do agree that there was some savings over during the period where we're not spending a whole lot. We're certainly not spending a lot of money on gas and driving around or traveling. But that itself, that whatever financial, the one thing you can depend upon about the American consumer is that they spend like there's no tomorrow. The savings rate for the average American consumer is, I think at one point it was actually negative. So whatever savings that have, they're likely to spend that money, but that money is going to not last forever. And likewise, the government assistance, we know that the COVID relief bills involved a one-time or two-time or whatnot payment to ease the pain of being out of a job, right? And also the unemployment benefits do not extend forever. There is an expiration date. In fact, I think most or a lot of the unemployment benefits in most of the states are about to expire. I'm talking about the extended unemployment benefits that were provided by Congress during this time. And they were extended, but they also had an explicit expiration date. And we're reading in the news that a lot of states are already cutting off that unemployment, the extra unemployment benefit. So the boost in spending, whether it's from temporary increase in savings due to the lockdown, excuse me, or to the the government support, they're by their nature are in fact temporary, right? It's not a permanent increase in your salary. You didn't win the lottery ticket. You didn't inherit Aunt Betha's inheritance money. Nothing like that. Not for the 99% of the people out there. So the overall assessment, when we look at the definition of inflation and the components that are involved in that, the way you can think about it is that inflation is not a thing. It's not a noun. It's not something you put in your pocket and carry around with it and say, okay, there it is. That's inflation. Inflation is the net result of market forces, the supply and demand, and prices reaching an equilibrium point, right? Inflation is a measurement of the prices and their relative rates of percentage of increase, right? And so we looked at the components of what drives inflation, and we've discussed that in the context of what's happening as we get out of the pandemic and the lockdown, thanks to the vaccines. And we see that the boost in consumer spending, whether it's real or not, it's by definition it's temporary. And the supply chain problems that are happening with on the business side, they're also starting to ease as well, right? Now, by now, you're kind of asking yourself, well, Carl, how do you know that? You say that, and I understand, okay, sure, you're an economist, but that doesn't mean that you're right. How do you know that for sure that things are actually starting to get better? Well, we know that because the pricing data is starting to come in, and it looks like, for example, there was quite a bit of talk about the surge in prices for lumber, which was real, but it's already starting to go down. Lumber prices are already starting to go down, so they're not headed straight up forever. It's the same thing with used car prices. They're elevated, but it looks like the percentage, the rapid increase in prices are also moderating. And in general, the price increases are also starting to moderate. So let me share another article with you, okay? So this is an article by Paul Krugman. And if you're not familiar with him, he is an economist who has won a Nobel Prize in economics. And so, it's an opinion piece. I acknowledge that. And, he obviously has his own personal bias or his own personal spin on this. But I think what you'll find in general with regards to in general with the economists is that when we're talking about economic data, when we're talking about economics, we are pretty apolitical because it's the numbers, it's the data, and so the title kind of gives away the punchline, but it's talking about the weak inflation panic died, and in my assessment, I have to agree with what he's saying, because like I said before, he's also pointing to the fact that people are everyone, it says here everyone was panicking about inflation and worried about 1970s. You saw on the chart right there, then in 1979 we're looking at 13% inflation, 12%. It dropped down to, but very, very high inflation relative to what we have now, which is 2% versus or 3.5%. So he's saying and by the way, this is what the way I was interpreting or analyzing the economic data as it was coming in. This is how I felt, for weeks now before he wrote this data. And this is simply a matter of economists looking at data and coming to agreement about their general assessment of what's going on with the direction of prices. And so the article mentions, yes, both recent data and recent statements from the Federal Reserve have deflated the case for a sustained outbreak of inflation. So the key word there is sustained outbreak, okay? Remember how we were talking about the real policy debate is whether these price increases were going to last for a while, over a year or past 2 years, or maybe even permanent. There was some talk, I thought a bit irresponsible, but some talk about permanent price increases, that as if they were never going to go away, as if the prices would never fluctuate again. Luckily, that was not said by an economist, but in any case, so he's framing the debate in similar terms the way that I have framed it to you, which is say the policy debate, the real one, is about the sustainability of these price increases. And so the question is it real? And so let's take another look at the data. Okay, he talks about the theory of inflation. He's talking about the core rate of inflation versus the other non-commodity items. So we're going to skip that because that's not really necessary. But he talks about how the Fed was right in not panicking about inflation because he said lumber prices have plunged in recent weeks, and they have. That's true. Prices of industrial metals like copper are coming down. Prices of used cars are still very high, but their surge has stalled and they may have peaked. What he's talking about is core inflation wins again. Well, what he's talking about there is that, the measurement of core inflation is that, certain staples and goods of the economy are a better measure of inflation than other goods, which are wildly fluctuating over the course of time, months and years. Now, let me talk briefly about the whole thing about the prices of used cars being still very high. So my interpretation on this, and this is just my personal opinion, but I think what's happening here is that, remember when we thought, the lockdown was going to be 3 months, right? I don't know why we thought that, but I mean, that was the kind of talk that was going on at the beginning. Maybe it was wishful thinking. We didn't want to believe it, but as we start to realize that the lockdown was going to be, months, and it ended into, 14 months. I'm sure there were a lot of people who needed to buy a new car or upgrade their car or transportation, and in those uncertain times, they delayed their decision. So coming out of the pandemic, coming out of the lockdowns, I'm sure people are saying, okay, I have a little money in my pocket and it's time for me to upgrade my transportation because, in American life, American society, you can't do without a car. You got to drive to work. You need a car to live. But they're probably saying, look, we're coming out of this recovery. Things are still uncertain. There's talk about all this, hyperinflation in the air. What does that mean? So they're probably thinking, hey, maybe I don't buy a new car. Excuse me for a second. Maybe I don't buy a new car right now. Maybe it's more sensible for me to buy a used car. And that's probably what's happening right now in that market. People are needing to, they might be saying, hey, my old Chevy is starting to make weird noises. There's smoke coming out of the tailpipe. The suspension's busted. And I need to buy something new, but I can't bring myself to buy a new Lexus, right? Getting a new Mercedes is out of the question. So let me look at what's happening with the used car market, and that's probably what's happening right now, right? But again, the overall point out of this is that people are coming out of the lockdown with some of the people, not all, because there's many people that are still suffering, but some of the people are coming out with some measure of disposable income, and they're saying, we need to get back to life. I need to drive to my job, and we need to get back to living life, going to the theaters and going to concerts, and watching the Lakers get swept out of the series. But hey, that's another story. I'm in California, by the way. So, what was I saying? Okay, yeah, right. Inflation. Not the Lakers. Inflation. So, that's what's happening right now, right? And so, when you look at the data, Paul Krugman is pointing out that price increases are moderating. That's what the latest data is showing. So this whole debate about permanence of price increases and how long they're going to stick around, is it temporary? I think the answer is clarifying itself in the recent data, and the answer is no. Okay. So now we've dispensed at the beginning with the whole notion of hyperinflation, with the definition, and all that, 50% and all that. Now we've teased out, the policy debate that's happening with regards to inflation, temporary, permanent, and the data is suggesting no, it's going in the direction that it is going to be temporary. And we discuss why. Because both the aggregate, the impact of the COVID, then the shutdown on aggregate supply and aggregate demand appears to be temporary, right? By the nature of it, right? So, so that is the proper way to just kind of interpret some of this pricing data that's coming out right now. No need to panic. Certainly, inflation is always a concern, but there are proper ways of fortifying your investment portfolio against price increases. But this talk about hyperinflation and this panic, kind of stuff is simply the wrong way to go about it. And I want to acknowledge, as I say that, I'm fully aware that there are many people out there who don't have the savings to even consider, retirement savings or investment savings, and they have had to deplete their financial resources. And I feel that. So I don't want to make light of that situation, but I'm just saying, we need to have a rational discussion about this. So, as a concluding remark, I want to share with you I think it's a funny article, and I promise you, it is related and very relevant to the discussion about inflation that we're having right now. So let me share that article with you. And the headline goes, okay, you know what? I'm going to confess to you. Actually, I used to watch this show. I used to watch The Price is Right with Bob Barker. They had the beautiful showcase girls, and it was exciting. You spin the wheel, and and of course, Drew took over. But the point of this article is that people are getting worse and worse at guessing the prices of items on the show, right? Sometimes they show you a car, they say, you might win a brand new car, a vacation to Tahiti or something. And you have to guess the price of the package or the car or the new appliance. Sorry, if you haven't seen the show, that's what it's about. People come on the show and you guess about the prices of different items. And the closer you are, then you win, right? And the study showed that, starting from during the 1970s and 80s. Okay, so I can't find the relevant passage, but what the studies found was that people had a harder time guessing the correct prices after the 1970s and 80s, and they just progressively got worse and worse guessing the price. Now, why is that relevant to our discussion, right? Well, it's because economists talk about inflationary expectations and how it impacts consumer behavior, right? People have some kind of built-in, kind of intuitive sense, about how price increases and how they're feeling about, what they're seeing when they go out to the stores and buy food and staple items and whatnot. And the studies show that, at least with regards to this show, and probably in general, really, people are very bad at guessing, not only guessing the prices of items, but the direction, right? People are really bad at it because they're not economists, they're not trained in this stuff, and they don't analyze data, right? So when the study looked at, what kind of, what was the reason for that, it's also very illuminating. Okay, so let me show that passage to you. First, inflation was much higher and less stable in the 1970s, right? And then after that, it started to moderate. So let's look at that chart right here. So during the 1970s, right, and going into the 1980s, like 82, 81, prices were still relatively high. And then starting into the 1990s, you see that inflation was relatively low and stayed low for a long time. And really what that means for consumers in terms of how they perceive inflation stuff is that when prices are fluctuating significantly, right, people have an incentive to pay attention to that sort of thing. They do, right? Just like we're starting to see headlines about inflation, and we're starting to have people getting worried about it and paying more attention to it. But after the 1980s, and prices start to stabilize, and they were at a historically low level, 4 to 2%, people had less incentive to track that because it had less impact on their lives. Their expectations about prices being stable led them to say, hey, you know what, I really don't really need to pay a whole lot of it, just devote so much mental energy in this. And so that's why they got worse at guessing prices on the Price is Right. Okay, so it's a funny study, but it kind of illustrates the point that there's a vulnerability out there in the public, especially with the recent stability of prices, that they're susceptible to this kind of talk about inflation tsunami and that sort of thing. And I thought, actually, that's a really good example of both the vulnerability in the public and how there are certain actors in the financial industry who are looking to prey upon that naivete, if that's the right word. And of course, there's a general increase of drumbeats of fear from the mass media because they want the clicks. They want they put together the clickbait headlines to scare you, so you'll click on that and read their article, right? So that's what this channel is about. I want to help you decode the financial news, the financial data, put them in proper perspective so that we can have a calm, rational discussion about what's happening with the economy, because those decisions really do matter, and they matter to your life, right? And so I felt now was really a good time to start this channel. This is, like I said, my first live stream. I kind of messed up on my first try. I forgot to hit the go live button. So I'm repeating everything that I said about an hour ago. But I hope you found this useful. I will be live streaming every Wednesday night and Sunday afternoon, and I'm here in California Pacific Standard Time. So if you'd like to have further discussions about the economic news and help, I'm wanting to help you kind of tease out what's the meaning, what's the proper context, then go ahead and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Good night.